Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Hidebound Convivium. I know it's been probably a good several months since I've actually done a solo video, and it's been, I think, even longer than that I've done one that's been completely unscripted, as this one is. Now, I do have some points I want to hit that are written down, but otherwise, I'm not working from a script, so if I'm a little bit all over the place, that's why. Also, the house is a little bit louder than it normally would be just because, everyone's awake and doing stuff. So, if there's any kind of noise in the background, that's why. But, what I really wanted to talk about was the recent spat of, as CNN would put it, mostly peaceful protests that have broken out across the country, across the civilized world, basically. And all these largely peaceful protests, of course, have to deal with the indelible legacy of the white man and his original sin, the stain that haunts all descendants of Europeans to this date, regardless of country of origin, as demonstrated by the frankly absurd demonstrations in places like Finland, for example. But I'm not really interested in trying to debunk all the narratives that go into the sort of the Black Lives Matter movement, the left-wing coalition, and why they're mistaken about these things. Because, well, I would be lying if I said that these riots didn't sort of make me a little bit, as we say colloquially on the right, black-pilled. It's hard for me to look at the whole thing and not come away with, a relatively pessimistic outtake on what this means for our movement going forward. Because what you're really seeing, if you want to put it in the most concrete terms, what you're seeing is people being allowed to use political violence in a scheme of personal enrichment coupled with this sort of normalization of violence to political ends. It's got a particularly virulent ethnic component. It's got a particularly virulent religious component, which is something I'm going to talk about. But what this has, in real terms, what this has done is it's brought home the point that our enemies are extremely powerful, having influence in very high places, and we are naturally, by comparison, incredibly weak. It's often been a topic of right-wing discourse that, if we retain our optics, so to speak, which has been very difficult for some people in the past few days, myself included, perhaps. As long as we maintain our optics and look presentable, then perhaps maybe one day we will have our own set of elites to bankroll us. But I think what this has demonstrated is that the propaganda potential of the mainstream media to push narratives has given a movement like Black Lives Matter, which is ostensibly a, well, not to put too fine a point on it, a terrorist organization. If they're willing to use violence to political ends, I thought that was the definition of a terrorist organization. Now, of course, there's all kinds of plausible deniability, and it's just a bunch of bad apples, and so on and so forth. So I won't get into that point, largely because it's irrelevant. To circle back to my last point, what that's driven home to us is that I don't think there's any amount of optics that's going to get the Bank of America to cut a check for $1 billion to the distant right, or any sort of up and coming system of elites The closest thing that we have to a sympathetic elite would be someone like maybe Elon Musk, who's just a weird, eccentric billionaire who likes space, which is not, and he's not even, he doesn't even technically support us or support our causes. He's just not openly hostile to us, which is, saying something. It's, you compare what is ostensibly a organization that is using or adjacent to political violence, and they can have all institutional power thrown behind them because, you know, of course, they're going along with institutional power, and similarly, if we maintain all the best optics, we can't even we couldn't even get verbal support from uh, any sort of elite. And of course, you guys already knew that. I'm just, this is something, I guess, that's brought into starker relief by these events, I might say. And to sort of piggyback off of that point of the mainstream narrative, how it gives Black Lives Matter, among other groups, plausible deniability for the things that they get involved with, how it tends to do very bizarre things like implicate white nationalists for riots that have a large ethnic component that you would not associate with white nationalism. It's just very interesting. And here's a point I want to bring home about media narratives and the mainstream media, is that, we on the right have been comfortable sort of arguing that the mainstream media is arguing itself into obsolescence by these sort of cockamamie, frankly silly takes that they will come out with that are obviously false to anybody who has sort of any inkling of knowledge about the actual situation on the ground. And yet, what I want to point out is it actually doesn't matter, because the average American may lose their faith in the media. They may think the media is just, entirely full of bullshit. But at the end of the day, that doesn't matter, because what the media does is not report the news. What they do is solidify narratives. Narratives being technologies that function within institutions of power, that create consensus, that turn the gears of institutional power towards some end. And so, in that way, it doesn't matter if a majority of Americans don't believe that, Black Lives Matter is completely non-peaceful, or, that, any particular convenient narrative that the media wants to spin to give cover to particular political actors. It doesn't really matter if the majority of the people are not sold on this, because the majority of the people don't have any political power. As long as this narrative can function to build consensus within institutions like the government, like NGOs, like the FBI, to be able to legitimize their actions, well, then that's really all that matters. And I mean, you can take the situation with COVID-19 as a clear example of this. I don't think anyone really believed for a second that public health officials actually knew what they were doing. I think everybody, for example, everyone, the common sense dictated that wearing a face mask was going to protect people from getting a respiratory virus. And yet, public health officials saying, oh, a mask actually doesn't protect you, it just protects other people, and blah, blah, blah. No one believed that. Everyone believed common sense before they believed, Dr. What's-His-Face on the television. And yet, this quote-unquote consensus of the scientific community was parroted by media officials, and this was what politicians and, more importantly, bureaucrats in health departments and related government organizations. This is what those people ran with in terms of justifying their decision making. And it doesn't matter if the majority of the people, adopted the common sense opinion that wearing a mask actually was going to protect you, that they're not going to go by that. Of course, they're going to go by the consensus that's parroted by the narrative making machine that is the mainstream media. So anyway, that's you see sometimes people are getting a little bit excited because all of these all these blatant contradictions that begin to arise in narratives, and I've never seen really the left-wing narrative like so obviously, patently, and openly contradict itself, and not just contradict itself in the sense that like there are some aspects of their worldview that don't mesh with others, because almost every human belief system has aspects of it that can contradict with other aspects of the belief system. I'm talking about things like basically factually contradicting yourself in the same breath and acting like this is normal and people are just supposed to go along with it. And I mean, I think the primary example that everyone's talking about is the fact that anti-lockdown protests during the COVID-19 lockdown, those were dangerous and bad, because just being within 10 feet of somebody in a open park with masks on, well, you never know, it could spread the virus, da 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 da. And yet in the same breath, you turn around and, oh yeah, actually tens of thousands of people looting and burning and protesting. Well, that's important. And do I believe that they think for a minute that systemic racism, that A, these protests are going to change anything about quote unquote systemic racism, and B, that systemic racism is actually going to kill more Black people than resurgence of the virus, when all they've been talking about for the last 40 forevers is how the virus disproportionately affects Black people? Do I think that they believe that for a second? No, I don't. And if they do, the self-delusion is truly deep-seated, I suppose. But here's the important thing. It doesn't matter that they openly and obviously contradict themselves. That's the narrative. That's what the decision-making, the powers that be, are going to run with. And it doesn't matter if we believe it or not. So in some sense, the media is just a way to set the agenda for the organs of state. It's not so much to actually get information to the people. But I feel like I'm preaching to the choir at this point. I think you guys already knew that. I've had a couple of other points I wanted to hit from the whole, riot thing and the response that right-wing people have had. One response is to cite the silent majority, is to say, well, all this political violence, all these riots and stuff, well, they're bad, but there's a silent majority of Americans that will rise up at the ballot box. And I'm like, okay, maybe that's true. I'm a little bit skeptical about how effective this silent majority is really going to be. Because first of all, let's say that's true, and let's say that the Republican, this is as much of a slam dunk for the Republicans as they think it is, and they can do absolutely nothing and coast to electoral victory in November. Okay, I don't know exactly how many congressional seats are up in November. I don't know how many Senate seats, and of course, obviously, the presidency is up in November. But let's say, slam dunk, they win the election, they sweep the floor with the Democrats, because those crazy Democrats are advocating crazy policies that have no place in America. Whatever. Okay, let's say that happens. Are they going to get anything done functionally? No. As we saw, in 2016, after Donald Trump was elected, the Republicans swept the Democrats in both chambers. They had a majority, and they had Trump. And did anything get done? No, absolutely nothing of substance got done. And in all this time, if Trump even attempts to do anything, it gets tied up in the courts, or he just, he more often than not, it's just Trump doesn't do anything. He doesn't deliver on any of his promises, which we all know that, politicians don't deliver on their campaign promises. But I mean, the whole system is kind of predicated on the idea that if you vote for people, they will give you stuff in return. And that's obviously not been the case. So, what good is our majority? Second of all, Republicans like to play up this whole silent majority thing, and then really what they're doing, they play up the majority part of the silent majority. What I want people to focus on is the silent part of the silent majority. That's simply because, as we know, politics is downstream from the culture. How do you influence the culture? Well, it's certainly not by being silent. And I understand people have good reasons for being silent, but I mean, that's pretty obviously the root of our loss in the culture wars, is that maybe we have a majority at the ballot box, but our electoral victories don't turn into anything. And then we maintain this silence in the face of all this cultural change. And you can see how it's eroded our, quote unquote majority over time, because the silent majority that we have now is kind of piss poor in relation to the silent majority like the Nixon administration, right? Because, think about it like this. In the latter half of the 20th century, the silent majority was the silent, morally, socially conservative majority of the country who weren't on board with the sort of left-wing social politics of the latter half of the 20th century. Okay, that's pretty good. What do we have? What's our silent majority now? It's the silent majority of people who, don't want to speak out about it, but they're not so much in favor of defunding the police. They actually think that having police might be a good idea. It might be beneficial to their neighborhoods to have them patrolled by police officers. And they want a little bit of reform, but they don't want all these radical social policies like getting rid of law enforcement. Which, and I mean, of course, this conversation is going to go around and around in circles, because people on the left will say, actually, we don't want to get rid of the police. We just want to have, we want to reduce funding for police departments. We want to transfer some duties over to social workers and blah, blah, blah. But then, that's one thing. And then you get to the rhetoric on the streets. The rhetoric on the streets is, we want no law enforcement. So, I mean, again, classic Mott and Bailey. How that ends up, nobody knows, really. It's going to depend on whatever is politically expedient at the time that you talk to this particular, whatever particular progressive. So, the actual truth of the policy aside, our silent majority has kind of degraded in effectiveness if the principle that we're rallying around is not defunding the police, not turning American metropolises into Mogadishu. And what's our silent majority going to be in 20 or 40 years? Is it going to be, well, I'm all right with a little bit of political violence every now and then, but once you start up the re-education camps and the gulags, well, that's just a step too far for me. But I won't speak out about it. Well, it's like, yeah, no, there's no point, because at that point, your silent majority gets frog marched through the gulags and the re-education camps, and it doesn't matter. So, yeah, there's your silent majority. It's absolutely useless. It either becomes a, audible majority, or it ceases to be functionally a majority because it does nothing for you. I guess that's enough of beating up on the silent majority. Some other dynamics that have emerged from the whole race riots thing that has been particularly troubling, or I should say that I should stop calling them that. They're quote unquote largely peaceful protests. That's the term I'm going to use. So in these largely peaceful protests, the phenomenon that a lot of people have noticed and sort of latched onto with a kind of curiosity and a little bit of shock and anger, disgust. There's a lot of emotions to feel about this particular phenomenon, but it's that whole thing with the white people kneeling down at the feet of black people. And when I first saw these pictures and these videos as they were, making the rounds on Twitter, I thought to myself, that looks familiar to me. I've seen this somewhere, and then I remembered what it is. To me, it reminds me a lot of going to confession. I'm a Catholic. I go to confession, and what you do when you go to confession is you kneel down in front of the screen, and you confess your sins to the priest, and they give you absolution. You go in and do a penance, and you're good. And what that's an example of is somebody humbling themselves, confessing their actual wrongs, and then being forgiven and absolved of their sins by a competent authority. In this instance, the priest, in the person of Christ. And I hesitate to call things demonic, or Luciferian, I should say. But when we talk about things as being demonic or Luciferian, what we're usually talking about is something that is an inversion of some sort of Christian practice. So, for example, you have a black mass in classical Satanism. It sounds like a weird thing, classical Satanism, but bear with me. So in Satanism, when you have these black masses, what do? They basically have an inverted Catholic mass, and they use consecrated hosts, unfortunately. And it's a kind of targeted sacrilege by doing doing a Catholic mass basically, but inverting certain principles and certain actions within the liturgical act. In this instance, what you see is people kneeling not to necessarily humble themselves, but to completely minimize themselves. It's not humility in the way that a conquered people might humbly bow to those that have conquered them in respect. It's more like the bow that a conquered people would exhibit towards a group of people who were conquering their nation taking them into bondage. It's a sort of forced groveling minimization of the self. It's not actually a form of humility. So you have this sort of false humility, the kneeling, okay? You're confessing sins, but you're not actually confessing your own sins. It's sins you have any culpability for. Now, we can argue about whether groups can have culpability for some actions, but I do think it is, I think most rational people would agree that it is, that, 20-something-year-old white liberals do not have any sort of moral culpability for, what occurred on a slave plantation in Georgia in 1852, or, the Atlantic slave trade in general. And yet, so these are not sins that these people can own. So nobody finds it surprising when they actually can't be absolved of these sins, and they're not. Their attempt at humility and being granted forgiveness is not accepted. And the question, of course, is like, how could you forgive these people? Because how can you forgive somebody who hasn't done anything wrong? That's a point of contention, I suppose, but the specific things they're talking about, these sorts of racial injustices since time immemorial, they're just not competent to confess these sins. Similarly, the people that they are bowing in homage to, who are not in persona Christi, although there is some debate as to whether George Floyd will rise again on the third day, I highly doubt it. These people are not competent to forgive them of their sins. So the whole thing is just an inversion of the sacrament of reconciliation. At least that is how it seems to me on its face. And I think that that sort of addresses the racial dimension of the whole, at least of the ethnic component of the conflict as it stands. Another interesting dynamic, I think, has been how this goes sort of hand in hand with the sort of final expunging of all Confederate and Southern identity from the wider American context. I was watching Fox News today because my grandfather had it on television in the living room. Watching Fox News today, and they had a Marine on there talking about how people just need to move past identifying with the Confederate States of America. And it would be a great thing if the military were to rename bases like Fort Bragg and Fort Hood and Fort Lee after true American patriots, specifically black and black and minority service members, of course, who have distinguished themselves in service to the United States. And there's been a lot of to do about how we shouldn't honor these traitorous people anymore, and we can't abide by honoring the Confederate States of America in our new tolerant multicultural country. And to be fair, what this symbolizes to me is a complete and total expungement of Southern identity from the wider American context. It's been going on for a while, but I think this, and it pains me to say it, but I think this is the final death knell of Southern culture. The people who would have defended it are, thoroughly discredited as people who should have any influence on national or even local politics. That being, poor working class white people from the South. And, unfortunately, Southern identity is indelibly linked with the Confederate States of America definitely for ill. I was about to say for good or ill, but definitely for ill, because, we are the only portion of the United States besides Texas, for example, that has this history of self-government, that has this history of desire for autonomy. And I just don't buy all this, talk about, we can't honor traitorous people that fought against this country, because the fact of the matter is it's a fundamental misunderstanding of what America is to say that these people fought against their country. The ideas that we have of America, what America is in terms of what it is mechanistically, were not shared by people in the 19th century before the war. And I'm going to get to that towards the end of this discussion. But what I would say is that there used to be a different conception of America that was primarily centered on the people and of their relationship to their specific region, of course, which we in the United States call states. And there was an intense amount of regional and local pride on the line in the Civil War, terrible war though it may be. And this is a fact that has been entirely lost to American history, as a monoculture pretty much engulfs the whole of the United States. And as unfortunate as it may be, this has led to what we're seeing today, which is, the final death knell of Southern identity as sort of a nationally recognized phenomenon. And more you'll just see, to be frank, you're just going to see the South carpetbagged into oblivion, either physically carpetbagged by, just Northerners or Californians or whoever moving into the South, or, just the culture papered over in the national media to the point where even Southerners forget that they ever had a distinct cultural identity, and they just cease to be, which is sad. But I think it's the inevitable, it's the inevitable product of these demonstrations, because as we've seen, there's no more there's no more compromise, and there's no more live and let live. Uh, this is the one thing that perhaps is going to solidify 2020 as a turning point year in American history, is that we used to believe in the United States in sort of these liberal ideas of dialogue, of of oh, what's the word? Compromise, of course. We used to believe in compromise. We used to believe in you do it your way, I'll do it my way. And this is fundamentally something that we just don't believe anymore, on the right or on the left, because, of course, we've noticed in the past several decades how allowing people to live and let live just gives your enemy excuses to hoard power that they can eventually use against you. And to what end has that been? Well, it's been to put us in the situation we are now, where, and I've talked about Southern identity, but American identity, as it would have been understood before the turn of the 21st century, is now almost entirely dead. And, whether for good or for ill, whatever follows will be different than what the United States has been throughout throughout the entire course of its over 200-year history. And I like to relate the conflict of what we're seeing today. The first thing I thought about when I really sat down to ponder all of this was the tragedy of Julius Caesar by William Shakespeare. Now, if people remember the tragedy of Julius Caesar, they probably remember it as a play that they read in high school. But the general plot outline is this, of course, if you don't know your Roman history. Julius Caesar successfully defeated the Roman general Pompey in a civil war. He returns to Rome and is to be crowned king. In order to prevent this from happening, the senators Brutus and Cassius, I can't remember their other names, so they'll just be Brutus and Cassius, they organize a famous betrayal of Caesar where they stab him in the Roman Senate. And this famously leads to another civil war where the conspirators are forced to fight the triumvirate, the people who are sympathetic to Caesar, primarily being among them Marc Antony and Octavian. And in the end, they are defeated. And this sets the stage for Octavian, later known as Augustus Caesar, to seize power. So it's an important and influential event in Roman history, and this is a particularly famous play portraying it. What I was doing is I was noticing parallels between the plot of this play and what's going on in the nation, in the wider national scene today. And the analogy is not perfect, but perhaps you can bear with me. So I identify the sort of old guard of the inner party, the left-wing coalition, as the sort of Brutus figure. Okay, and I identify sort of the ascendant, hard left, progressive wing of the inner party as being the Cassius figure. Now, who is Julius Caesar in all this? Julius Caesar is an interesting character. I think you could make Caesar stand for not the American Republic, but the intangible aspects of American identity that were what made America America for most of its history. So these are, of course, its heritage as a European nation with a predominantly European ethnic and cultural makeup, particularly a Christian nation, despite having various idiosyncrasies in its relationship to Christianity. It's being a particularly socially conservative, traditional nation, not a revolutionary one. ironically, given the country's founding. And moreover, uh, it's the United States used to embody things like the traditional family, like patriarchy, like traditional religion. All of these intangible aspects that go into America, the culture, the ethnos, the customs, all of these can be represented in the person of Julius Caesar, the strong old man. These are, and it's interesting if you compare this to Julius Caesar's relationship to the Roman Republic, to all these intangible values and their relationship to the American Republic. The American Republic is primarily a mechanism for white liberals and progressives. So for Brutus and Cassius, the Republic is a machine for egalitarianism. It is a machine for radical liberation. And they see the strongman, the Julius Caesar, as being an obstacle to this, when in reality, the strong old man, the Julius Caesar, is the reason that the Republic can exist. Because, as people who know their Roman history know, that Rome has often relied on strong men to be able to protect them from barbarians. A republic is not a particularly robust form of government, especially in the ancient period. And so the fact that the Roman Republic survived is more or less down to their martial virtue and the virtue of their strong generals and leaders, rather than any other sort of historical idiosyncrasy. Now, of course, the Roman Republic was transformed into an empire, but of course, this is not a perfect analogy. At any rate, you see these the progressive wing of the party is willing to kill off these intangible aspects of what made America America. And particularly, they want to do this for power. And I don't see the same sort of relationship with the sort of white liberal wing of the party that has to be dragged, kicking and screaming, into more radical action against the status quo. But nevertheless, the result, of course, is the murder of the intangible aspects of American culture, the things that made America America, in service of the preservation of the mechanism. So people may remember that Brutus in the play gave this famous speech after they've killed Caesar, of course. He says, "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I have come not to praise Caesar, but to bury him." And he explains to the crowd, of course, that he didn't kill Caesar because he hated him. It was not, as he says, that he loved Caesar less, but that he loved Rome more. And there's a similar sort of dynamic going on. It's not that we loved American culture less. It's just that, to be fair, the analogy does break down a little bit here, because I think among the liberal wing of the party, the thing to overcome is not their lack of hatred of America, more just their apathy. But nevertheless, they had to overcome that in order to kill these intangible things for the health of their machine for creating equality and radical liberty. And so, the other conspirators end up being the useful idiots, the rioters and looters, for example, the people who are willing to be the foot soldiers of the new regime that is being put into place. And this whole analogy is interesting, because then it leaves you with the question of who ends up being the Marc Antony and the Octavian. Because, as we know, this all doesn't go well. There's a lot of people who have been prophesying sort of a right-wing backlash in case things get really bad. I don't know about that, but there certainly will be some sort of backlash at some point. We all know that those that spearhead the revolution oftentimes don't end up at the head of the revolution. In fact, this is basically a law of left-wing revolution, is that inevitably the left-wing revolutionaries are killed and replaced with, well, for lack of a better word, reactionaries. People who will toe the party line, but people who, nonetheless have agendas that are not technically or not especially ideologically driven, right? The Trotsky to Stalin pipeline, so to speak. Now, does that mean we're going to be the Marc Antonys? No, I don't think so. Or if we were to end up like anybody, it would probably be Marc Antony, who, as we all know, gets a second arc, Antony and Cleopatra, and we all know how that ends up as well. Who ends up being the Octavian in the analogy? Well, perhaps there is no Octavian in the analogy. Perhaps this is the place where the analogy breaks down, and instead of the American Republic going on to be the glorious American Empire, as it kind of already is, perhaps the Walking Dead, as quoted in William Shakespeare's play, perhaps the dead corpses rising up in the streets of Rome to protest the death of Caesar, perhaps they just overtake the Republic. Who's to say? I don't know if I have any real good advice for people in our movement, people on our side of the political spectrum, going forward, looking at the devastation and wondering what we should do about it. I don't know if I can offer anything other than just to sit back, take notes, and formulate strategies that at the end of the day will be more productive than will hurt our cause. Because I think there's a lot of blind rage, there's a lot of confusion, and there's a lot of hopelessness proliferating. And I want to be able to tell people that there are reasons for hope. But I don't know if that extends to the continued existence of the United States or even the Western world as we've seen it. What I do know is that something better eventually, somewhere down the line, will come about. And I think for the time being, all we can do is turn inwards, be brothers, and reconnect with those in our lives who are right next to us. Because if the worst case scenario really were to happen, these are the people that you're in it with. And the last thing you'd want to do is annoy these people with your constant pessimism. But other than that, I don't know what to say. I think for those of us of a more religious inclination, there should be a lot of prayer being done for our country right now. And perhaps with enough prayer, with enough fasting and repentance, or perhaps with enough good luck, something better even than America as we've known it will rise out of the, frankly hopeless situation that some of us see today. That's what I hope, at least. For the Hidebound Convivium, this has been an excellent chat. Thank you all, and good night.